Mocked for his mail-order plaything, Second Lieutenant John George was the Army's final hope after 11 snipers took the lives of 14 men at Point Cruz. Armed with the Winchester his commanders ridiculed, George entered the jungle for a lethal duel that would silence the Gifu forever. The ridicule had started long before the initial trigger pull, back in the relatively secure training grounds of Camp Forest, Tennessee. When Second Lieutenant John George first unboxed his Winchester Model 70, the unit's armorer did not observe a precision-engineered instrument. He saw a liability. To the inflexible military perspective of 1942, a rifle was supposed to be a tool of rugged, interchangeable components, designed to be dragged through the mire. The Winchester, with its hand-polished bolt, adjustable trigger assembly, and high-gloss walnut furniture, appeared like a remnant of a more refined era of sport hunting. George's superior officer, Captain Morris, was even more direct, dismissing the bolt-action rifle as a toy and commanding George to utilize a real weapon, specifically the semi-automatic M1 Garand. But George possessed a clarity his peers lacked. He understood that firepower was irrelevant if you could not visually acquire your objective. The standard iron sights on the M1 Garand were designed for a Battle Zero, which was effective for striking a human-sized silhouette in a general vicinity. But they were far too thick and obscured the target at significant distances. At 27 years of age, George was an Illinois state shooting champion who had saved 2 years of National Guard wages to acquire this specific firearm. He understood the mathematics of ballistics, the delicate interplay between projectile weight, muzzle velocity, and atmospheric density. He recognized that in the claustrophobic, light-deprived canopy of the Pacific, standard-issue sights frequently became useless dark shapes against the deep green environment. The technical details of the rifle were, to George, a pinnacle of American engineering. The Winchester featured a 24-inch heavy barrel with a 1 in 10-inch twist rate, perfectly calibrated to stabilize the 180-grain projectiles he favored for the jungle. Unlike mass-produced military rifles, the Winchester's receiver was carved from a single block of high-carbon steel, providing a structural rigidity that resulted in consistent, repeatable accuracy. Every time he manipulated the bolt, the mechanical clink-clack sounded like music to his ears, a promise that the next round would impact exactly where the fine crosshairs rested. He had selected the Lyman Alaskan scope specifically because it was engineered for hunting in the dim light of dawn and dusk. Its high-quality glass actually gathered light, and its exceptionally fine reticle did not cover a man's head at 300 yards, while his fellow officers boasted about how many rounds they could send toward the enemy in 10 seconds. George focused exclusively on the cold bore shot, that crucial first bullet from a clean, cool barrel. After the rifle was lost during transit and finally recovered in a battered wooden crate labeled fragile, George carried it into the jungle despite the persistent threat of a court-martial. He spent his nights verifying the tension on his scope mounts with the precision of a jeweler. He knew that even a single degree of movement in the mount would result in a miss of several feet at 300 yards. Every time he brought the weapon to his shoulder, he was validating a core belief that in this theater of war, the individual who saw first was the individual who remained among the living. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had relieved the Marines in late December of 1942, immediately stepping into a vicious struggle. While George remained on the periphery of the action, his battalion spent 16 agonizing days attempting to storm the Gifu, a 1,514-foot-high monolith and a fortress consisting of 47 interconnected bunkers. The Gifu was a structural nightmare. The defenders had cleared shooting lanes so accurate that an American soldier could be struck down before he even realized he had entered the open ground. The battalion suffered 34 men whose lives were taken and 279 men who were severely wounded in just a few weeks. Throughout that entire period of carnage, George had not fired his Winchester a single time. He felt like a champion athlete forced to sit on the bench, watching his comrades perish against an adversary they could not even see. The mental burden was a physical weight, more oppressive than the tropical humidity and more agonizing than the jungle rot. Every morning, George would verify his rifle's zero, peering through his optics at distant leaves and imagining the crosshairs settled over the opening of a bunker. He watched with a heavy heart as the wounded were transported down the muddy paths of Mount Austin, their eyes reflecting the vacant, thousand-yard stare of men who had been hunted by a phantom force. The morale of the battalion was beginning to crumble. The soldiers began to mutter that the jungle was a living entity, that the trees themselves were responsible for the casualties. The climate was a relentless adversary. Temperatures regularly reached 100 degrees by midday, with humidity levels so high that perspiration pooled in your boots. George watched as his men struggled with their M1 Garands when the wooden stocks began to swell in the moisture, sometimes causing the internal mechanisms to bind. George remained obsessed, oiling his Winchester every 3 hours and treating the walnut furniture with linseed oil to prevent a similar failure. He was a bastion of order in a sea of entropic chaos, and his devotion to his rifle was beginning to provoke resentment from the exhausted infantrymen surrounding him. By the time the unit reached the coastal palm groves of Point Cruz, the frustration had evolved into total desperation. Here, the landscape changed from jagged mountain ridges to stifling, flat coconut plantations. In this place, the adversary was not hiding behind reinforced concrete. They were positioned in the heavens. The banyan trees, with their sprawling aerial root systems and dense leaf cover, created a vertical maze. On January 19th, Corporal Davis was lost while simply attempting to fill a canteen at a muddy stream. On the 20th, 2 more men met their end. On the 21st, 3 more were eliminated. 1 man was struck through the neck from a tree that the patrol had already walked past on 2 separate occasions. The realization was terrifying. The enemy was allowing the Americans to pass, waiting for the most helpless moment to engage. They were utilizing spider holes high in the canopy and tethering themselves to branches so that even if they were hit, their remains would not fall and reveal their concealed position. It was psychological combat at its most primal level. The battalion commander, a man pushed to his breaking point by the rising total of the fallen and the powerlessness of his situation, finally sent for George. He no longer cared about military regulations. He cared only about halting the slaughter. He looked George in the eye and asked if his rifle could truly locate the ghosts. George provided a professional guarantee of 300-yard surgical precision. He was given until daybreak to silence the groves. George spent the night in absolute clinical focus. He disassembled the Winchester completely, removing the salt-saturated grease and replacing it with a microscopic film of oil. He hand-inspected his .30-06 caliber hunting ammunition, checking every single brass casing for slight imperfections. These were not standard-issue military ball cartridges. They were 180-grain soft-point projectiles designed to expand on impact and fly with a true trajectory through the heavy, moisture-saturated air. He even used a blackened match to smoke his front sight and objective lens, ensuring there would not be a single glint of reflected sunlight to betray his hiding place. The morning of January 22nd arrived with a flat, grayish light. George moved into the hollowed-out debris of a destroyed bunker. The air was a stagnant mixture of ocean spray and rotting vegetation. He settled into the coral dust and began to glass the groves. To the unaided eye, it appeared as an impenetrable wall of green. To George, through the Lyman Alaskan, it was a high-resolution grid of potential engagement zones. The 2.5 power magnification provided the ideal balance of close-up detail and a wide field of view in the thick jungle. He detected a tiny tremor, 240. Yards away, a branch moved in a direction that contradicted the natural rhythm of the wind. George observed the shadows for 15 minutes without moving a muscle. Then, the light shifted just enough to expose a sliver of dark material and the dull, matte finish of a metal barrel. A sniper was perched in a 3-branch fork, his Arisaka rifle resting on a thick limb. George adjusted his windage by 2 clicks to the right, a minor correction for the light breeze. He felt the crisp 3.5-pound break of his trigger, a weight he had practiced with until it felt like a natural extension of his own nervous system. He fired. The recoil was a sharp shove against his shoulder. 240 yards away, the dark shape moved violently and then plummeted. The marksman did not cry out. He simply ceased to be, tumbling 90 feet through the branches before impacting the soil with a heavy thud. 20 minutes later, George detected the second man. He was 50 feet up in a different tree, 60 yards to the north. This was the spotter, and he was clearly in a state of panic. He had witnessed his partner perish and was desperately trying to climb down the trunk. George did not rush the shot. He led the target, placing the crosshairs slightly ahead of the descending soldier's torso, compensating for the velocity of his movement. He squeezed the trigger. The spotter fell backward. 2 shots. 2 adversaries neutralized. The mockery in the officers' quarters ended that very morning, replaced by a somber respect. The men of the 132nd were beginning to understand that George was a precision instrument of removal. By the second day, the hunter had become the prey. The enemy marksmen realized they were facing a highly trained specialist. They began to move only under the cover of frequent tropical rainstorms. After George dispatched his 6th sniper at a distance of 290 yards, a range that pushed the maximum limits of the Arasaka's iron sights, the enemy stopped trying to win a fair fight. They calculated his position based on his muzzle flash and launched a mortar attack that transformed the ground into a landscape of fire and shrapnel. The first mortar shell impacted 40 yards short. George grabbed his Winchester and sprinted toward the north, his boots sliding on the slick floor. The second shell landed 20 yards closer. He leaped into a jagged shell crater just seconds before a direct hit disintegrated the bunker he had been occupying. The explosion was a wall of heat and noise that left his ears ringing, but his rifle remained held tightly against his chest. He understood at that moment that this was no longer a shooting competition. It was a struggle for survival. He spent the next several hours in the crater, the rain falling so heavily it threatened to drown him. He kept the bolt of his Winchester closed tightly, covering the action with his waterproof poncho. He knew that the very moment the rain eased, the enemy marksman would be scanning for him. The silence that followed the storm was even more terrifying than the mortars. Every shadow in the trees seemed to contain a hidden rifle. George's nerves were under extreme tension, but his hands remained perfectly steady. He was a professional, and he had a mission to complete. The stakes reached their peak on January 24th. Only 3 snipers remained, the veterans who had survived George's first 2 days. George moved to a new position 70 yards south in a jagged pile of rocks. At 8:17 in the morning, he spotted the 9th sniper sitting low in a palm tree. Only 40 feet above the ground, he was clearly visible, his rifle barrel sticking out through the fronds. It was far too easy. To George, it felt like an insult to his intelligence. George's finger rested on the trigger, but he did not pull it. His survival instincts told him that this was a clever trap. A marksman who survives 3 days of a counter-sniper operation does not sit exposed in a palm tree. He slowly scanned the surrounding canopy, ignoring the salty sweat stinging his eyes. Finally, he located the true threat. Number 10 was hidden behind a thick curtain of vines 91 feet up in a massive banyan tree, his rifle aimed directly at George's rock pile. The man in the palm tree was merely bait, a sacrificial decoy intended to force George to reveal his position. George utilized the information gap to his own advantage. He neutralized the bait in the palm tree first. As he expected, the real sniper in the banyan shifted his torso to face the sound, believing he had identified George's location. In that split second of movement, the sniper's silhouette became clearly defined. George swung his barrel and sent a round through the man's chest before he could even raise his Arasaka. But the 11th man was a ghost. At 9:47, George detected a slight ripple in the ferns 60 yards to the south. The final sniper was crawling through the thick mud, attempting to flank the rocks from the ground. George lowered himself into a water-filled crater, mud covering his face, holding his Winchester vertically. He watched as the sniper and a support gunner crawled past within 20 yards of his position. As soon as their backs were turned, George rose like a spectral force and finished both men with 2 rapid trigger pulls. As George climbed out of the water-filled crater, he heard the sharp, unmistakable snap of breaking branches. A recovery patrol of 6 infantrymen was approaching, alerted by the final shots. George dropped back into the water. He was significantly outnumbered, and his bolt-action rifle was at a severe disadvantage against rapid-fire weapons. He was forced into a desperate, close-range struggle for his life. As the first enemy soldier reached the edge of the crater, George fired from the hip. He rose up and downed 2 more soldiers as they scrambled for cover, then sprinted toward the north under a heavy hail of fire. He had only 3 rounds remaining and a heart hammering against his ribs. By 11:13, George finally reached the safety of American lines, his face a hardened mask of dried mud. He reported his 14 total, confirmed eliminations to Captain Morris, who simply nodded and handed him a water canteen. The Grove, which had been a place of certain death for an entire week, was finally silent. As the battalion began the process of moving their equipment forward, George sat on a supply crate and observed the intelligence teams. They were processing a group of Italian POWs who had been captured during a nearby flanking maneuver. These men appeared completely drained, their uniforms reduced to rags, a stark contrast to the elite marksmen George had just spent 4 days hunting. The Italian POWs were a strange sight in the middle of the Pacific Theater. Some had been serving as technical specialists or advisors. They were huddled together in a small group, their eyes wide with the shock of capture, as they were questioned about the remaining strength of the coastal fortifications. Their presence was a clear signal that the enemy's main defensive line was finally disintegrating. George felt a strange sense of emotional distance as he watched them. He had just spent days taking lives from a great distance, and seeing the adversary up close, vulnerable and defeated, was a jarring shift in his perspective. The clearing of Point Cruz was a significant victory, but a new phase was already beginning. Colonel Ferry, the regimental commander, arrived that afternoon. He no longer made jokes about the mail-order rifle. He looked at the weapon with the profound reverence of a man observing a holy relic. He recognized that George's specialized methods had fundamentally changed the nature of the coastal campaign. He commanded George to transform his personal success into an official military doctrine. George was provided with 14 Springfield rifles equipped with high-powered unertl telescopic sights and 40 of the regiment's best marksmen. He was ordered to construct the Army's first formal sniper section from the ground up. The training process was brutal. George pushed the 40 men to their absolute physical and mental limits, forcing them to spend hours motionless in the mud. He taught them the science of mirage and how to lead a moving adversary by trapping them within the crosshairs. He emphasized that a marksman's most vital tool is not his rifle, but his disciplined mind. George had to prepare them for the immense psychological burden of observing their target's facial expressions before they ended their lives. By the conclusion of the month, he had successfully transformed a group of farm boys and city residents into a lethal unit of precision marksmen. But even as he began training his men, George received word of a top-secret assignment. The Pacific was a massive chessboard, and his unique set of skills was required in a different theater. Orders arrived for a long-range penetration unit being formed for a mission in the deep, unmapped jungles of Burma. This was a campaign spanning an entire continent against the absolute elite of the enemy's military forces. This was a unit known as Merrill's Marauders. George looked at his Winchester, which he had cleaned until it was once again gleaming. He knew that the jagged mountains of Burma would present a different set of challenges, but the mathematics of the traveling bullet remained the same. The relocation to Burma was a massive shock. While Guadalcanal had been a humid swamp, Burma was a landscape of brutal extremes. The Marauders were expected to march hundreds of miles through the foothills of the Himalayas, carrying every single item they needed to survive on their backs. George meticulously camouflaged his Winchester with strips of burlap and local plants. The rifle was no longer a beautiful sporting piece. It had become a tool of the deep wilderness, battle-scarred like the man who carried it. The marches were agonizingly difficult. The men suffered from the constant threat of disease and physical exhaustion. George's role was to move well ahead of the main body, acting as the eyes and ears of the entire force. He was frequently miles away from any possible support, relying entirely on his own survival skills. In the thin air of the mountains, the ballistics of the .3006 cartridge changed significantly. George had to manually recalculate his holdovers for the higher elevation, a technical task he performed with the same cold, clinical precision he had utilized at Point Cruz. One late evening, George detected a group of men moving through the thick fog below. They were not combat soldiers. They were another group of Italian POWs, survivors of a forced labor detail left behind by their retreating captors. George chose to help guiding the drained men through the dangerous jungle for 2 full days until they reached a marauder outpost. It was a rare moment of compassion in a campaign defined by extreme severity, and it earned George the genuine respect of even the most cynical veterans in the unit. The campaign reached its intense climax at the strategic airfield of Myatkina. After many months, the marauders had reached the crucial airfield as a force of walking skeletons. George's role became critical during the siege. The airfield was a vast expanse of open ground surrounded by impenetrable jungle, making it a perfect environment for marksmen. The enemy had fortified themselves within the wreckage of airport structures, using the reinforced concrete as defensive cover. George spent 4 days perched on the corrugated steel roof of a hangar, timing his shots to coincide with the roar of incoming C-47 transport aircraft. The noise of the engines was enough to mask the report of his Winchester, allowing him to neutralize machine gun nests that were preventing the arrival of essential medical supplies. He recorded 12 confirmed removals of the enemy during the airfield siege alone. It was in this place that he truly realized the massive psychological power of the marksman. The enemy stopped firing because they were completely terrified to move. The environmental conditions at Myatkina were absolutely wretched. The monsoon season had arrived, transforming the airfield into a sea of red mud. The soldiers were living in deep foxholes, perpetually filling with rainwater. Disease was everywhere. George himself was suffering from a recurring attack of malaria, but when he looked through his scope, his hands became perfectly still. The rifle was his anchor, the only thing in his entire world that still operated logically. He worked in 12-hour shifts, his eyes red and strained from searching for targets in the endless rain. Toward the conclusion of the long siege, George's platoon captured a small group of enemy officers. Traveling with them were several Italian POWs who had been pressed into service as forced porters. George watched as the prisoners were led away, their tired faces a mirror of the same deep exhaustion he felt. He realized then that the war was a gargantuan machine that destroyed everyone caught in its gears. The eventual capture of the airfield was a major strategic win, but for George, it was simply another long day of the hunt. As the war across the Pacific finally drew toward its end, George was reassigned to a vital training role back in the United States. He took the hard-won lessons from the groves of Point Cruz and the hangars of Myatkina and wrote them down, creating what would become the foundation of modern American sniper doctrine. He was no longer the mail-order misfit. He was a respected authority on the science of small arms and precision marksmanship. He spent his days at Fort Benning, Georgia, instructing a new generation of American soldiers. He taught his students that a marksman is not merely a shooter, but a vital collector of tactical intelligence. He emphasized the critical importance of urban sniping, utilizing the ruins of buildings and hangars as compared to jungle sniping among the banyans. He spent his few free weekends on the firing range, testing new telescopic optics, searching for that microscopic advantage. He never allowed himself to stop being a student of the rifle. He understood that while the technology would inevitably evolve, the core fundamentals of the hunt remained timeless. His published work, titled Shots Fired in Anger, was a comprehensive technical manual that corrected the United States Army's long-standing failure to appreciate specialized marksmanship. He argued that the semi-automatic M1 Garand, while being a magnificent battle rifle, could never replace a bolt-action precision instrument in specialized roles. He provided a detailed analysis of the Arisaka, the Springfield, and his own beloved Winchester. He became a powerful voice for the individual infantryman, the man who had to live and perish based on the quality of the tools provided by the government. The book became an instant classic in the field. George's writing style was exactly like his shooting, direct, clinical, and completely devoid of unnecessary ego. He did not attempt to glamorize the act of taking a life. Instead, he described it as a technical problem that demanded a technical solution. He gave credit to his adversaries when it was earned, even praising the skill and bravery of the enemy marksmen he had faced. He understood that a genuine respect for the enemy's capabilities was the first necessary step toward defeating them. In his older years, George frequently reflected on the remarkable coincidences that had defined his war. He remembered the many Italian POWs he had encountered on Guadalcanal and in the high mountains of Burma, often wondering what had happened to them. He realized that the war had forced people from every corner of the globe into contact in the most vicious ways imaginable. He spent much of his retirement traveling, visiting the locations where he had fought, though the aggressive jungle had long ago overgrown the bunkers. He found that he felt a strange kinship with the men he had once hunted, a shared understanding of the cold, solitary life of the professional marksman. He lived long enough to witness the official birth of the modern American sniper program, which was a direct intellectual descendant of the improvised school he had started. He watched as the United States military finally fully embraced the immense value of the specialized marksman, establishing dedicated training schools and developing high-tech weapon systems. He was frequently invited to speak at these elite schools, where the young marksmen looked at him with genuine awe. He would always tell them the same thing. The rifle does not create the marksman. It is the disciplined marksman who creates the rifle. John George passed away in the year 2009 at the advanced age of 90, but his legendary Winchester Model 70 remains a centerpiece in the National Firearms Museum. It sits behind a glass display, a mail-order plaything that fundamentally changed the trajectory of a war. Most visitors walk past it without ever realizing the weight of its history, but those who are familiar with the story always stop and linger. They see the worn walnut wood and the heavy bolt, and they imagine a lone man sitting in a water-filled crater, waiting with the infinite, cold patience of the master hunter. John George demonstrated that in the brutality of the jungle, precision is the ultimate tool for survival. If you believe that stories of such individual grit and determination deserve to be preserved, please click that like button and subscribe to join our community of history hunters. It is the most effective way to ensure these archives remain accessible. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Would you have placed your trust in a civilian sporting rifle in 1943? Or do you believe the firepower of the semi-automatic Garand was the superior choice? We are dedicated to rescuing these forgotten narratives from dusty archives every single day. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us ensure that the legacy of John George does not fade into silence. These men truly deserve to be remembered, and your engagement helps us achieve that goal.